The land below offers no guidance. It stretches outward in muted tones, dust, scrub, and shadow blending into one continuous surface. There are no sharp edges, no defining lines, only subtle variations in texture where the earth shifts from dry grassland to scattered woodland. From altitude, it becomes a pattern without meaning. Above it, the aircraft maintains a steady course. The engines produce a constant, even rhythm, mechanical and reassuring. No fluctuation, no sign of distress. The structure holds firm against the airflow. Its surface is stable, its trajectory deliberate. Inside the cockpit, there is no indication of failure. The instruments are simple, but they are functioning as designed. A compass needle, steady but vulnerable to interpretation. A map, detailed but dependent on accuracy. A horizon, present but increasingly unreliable. The aircraft continues forward. The sky is not hostile. There is no storm, no violent turbulence. But visibility is not absolute. A thin veil of atmospheric haze softens the contrast between land and sky. Distant features dissolve before they can be clearly defined. Shapes appear, then fade, then reappear as something else. What should be a reference becomes an assumption. The terrain beneath is rising, but gradually, so gradually that it escapes immediate notice. There are no cliffs, no dramatic elevation changes, only a slow, almost imperceptible climb of the earth toward the aircraft's path. From this altitude, it remains invisible as a threat. Inside the cockpit, navigation depends on recognition. A river bend, a ridgeline, a clearing. Each must match what is expected. Each must confirm position. But the land is repeating itself. Patterns echo across distance. Similar ridges, similar clearings, similar lines cut by erosion and time. Without precise instrumentation, distinction becomes judgment. And judgment, in the absence of clarity, becomes vulnerable. The aircraft holds its heading. There is no abrupt correction, no sudden doubt that forces immediate reconsideration. Only a quiet continuity, a belief that the course is correct, reinforced by what appears to align with expectation. Time passes. The engines continue their steady cadence. The A-frame moves forward without resistance. The altitude remains constant relative to the instruments. But relative to the ground, the margin is changing. Slowly, silently, the haze thickens slightly, not enough to obscure completely, but enough to reduce depth. The horizon softens further. Distance compresses. Objects that should appear distinct instead blend into a uniform field of muted color. The illusion deepens. Navigation in this environment is not a matter of precision. It is a process of confirmation. And confirmation, when based on incomplete information, can reinforce the wrong conclusion as easily as a correct one. Below, the terrain continues its gradual ascent. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply exists, rising into the aircraft's path with quiet certainty. Inside the cockpit, the workload is not excessive. There is no emergency to manage, no system failure to diagnose. Only the ongoing task of maintaining course, verifying position, and trusting the alignment between expectation and observation. That alignment is beginning to drift. Not dramatically, not in a way that forces immediate recognition, but enough that each passing minute compounds a discrepancy. A landmark appears. It resembles what should be there. The shape is close enough. The position, plausible. It offers reassurance, the kind that stabilizes uncertainty rather than challenges it. The course remains unchanged. Altitude is maintained. The aircraft continues forward. There is no alarm to sound, no warning system to intervene, no automated voice to question the decision. In this era of aviation, awareness depends entirely on interpretation, and interpretation depends on clarity. The haze does not lift. The ground does not reveal its true form. The aircraft descends slightly, not abruptly, but as part of a controlled adjustment, a routine action, consistent with expected approach conditions. The intention is not risk. It is alignment, but the reference point is wrong. The terrain ahead is no longer distant. It is rising into proximity, still partially concealed by the same muted haze that has obscured it from the beginning. The margin is narrowing. The engines continue their steady output. There is no change in tone, no indication that the environment ahead is incompatible with the aircraft's current path. Inside the cockpit, the belief in position remains intact. Outside, reality has shifted. The final moments are not chaotic. They are not defined by sudden panic or loss of control. The aircraft remains stable. The descent remains controlled. The error is not in execution. It is in understanding. The ground appears too late to reinterpret. What was assumed to be distance is now immediacy. What was believed to be safe altitude is now insufficient. The terrain, once indistinct, resolves into form with sudden clarity. There is no time for correction, no distance left to recover. The aircraft continues forward, exactly as it has been, until it no longer can. Silence follows, not immediate, but inevitable. The engines, once constant, are no longer part of the landscape. The motion ceases. The sky remains unchanged above, and the terrain returns to stillness below. There is no visible marker from afar, no signal to indicate what has occurred, only a disruption within the vast continuity of land, a point where flight intersected with ground under the weight of miscalculation. The landscape absorbs it without resistance. From a distance, nothing appears different. The horizon remains soft. The haze lingers, and the space between certainty and assumption, brief, narrow, and unforgiving, closes without acknowledgement. In 1938, aviation was no longer experimental, but it was not yet precise. Aircraft crossed continents with increasing regularity. Passenger routes expanded, linking cities separated by vast distances. Schedules existed. Expectations formed around reliability. The act of flight had transitioned from spectacle to service. But beneath that progress, uncertainty remained embedded in the process. Navigation was still, in many respects, an interpretive skill. Across Australia, this challenge was amplified by geography. The distances between major cities were significant, and much of the land between them offered few distinguishing features from the air. Sparse population meant limited infrastructure. There were no extensive networks of radio beacons, no radar coverage, no electronic guidance systems capable of continuously verifying position. The sky was open. The land below, largely unmarked. One of the most critical corridors in the country connected Sydney and Melbourne. It was a route of both economic and symbolic importance, linking two major centers of activity across hundreds of miles of varied terrain. Airlines operating along this path relied on a combination of established procedures and accumulated experience. Among them was Australian National Airways, one of the leading carriers of the period. Its operations represented the growing confidence in commercial aviation within the country. Aircraft were scheduled, maintained, and crewed with increasing professionalism. Passengers boarded with the expectation of reaching their destination not as an exception, but as a norm. Yet the system supporting that expectation was still incomplete. Navigation during this era depended heavily on dead reckoning. Position was calculated based on a known starting point, combined with estimated speed, heading, and elapsed time. Adjustments were made for wind drift, but these corrections relied on prediction as much as measurement. Without continuous external reference, small errors could accumulate. A few degrees off course, sustained over distance, could translate into miles of deviation. To counter this, Pilots relied on visual navigation. Rivers, coastlines, railway lines, and prominent terrain features served as checkpoints. These landmarks were compared against maps carried in the cockpit, maps that, while detailed for their time, were not always precise in scale or representation. The process required constant interpretation. What appeared below had to match what was expected, and when it did, confidence increased. When it did not, uncertainty emerged, but not always immediately, because the land could resemble itself. In regions between Sydney and Melbourne, the terrain offered repeating patterns. Rolling hills, patches of woodland, and irregular clearings formed visual sequences that could appear similar from altitude. In conditions of reduced visibility, haze, low cloud, or diffuse light, distinction became even more difficult. This was not considered abnormal. It was accepted as part of flight. Aircraft themselves were reliable within their design limits, but their instrumentation reflected the era. The cockpit did not provide a comprehensive picture of the aircraft's environment. It provided fragments, altitude, heading, engine performance, leaving position to be constructed through external reference and calculation. There were no terrain warning systems, no automated alerts, no independent verification of proximity to the ground beyond what could be seen or inferred. Communication, too, was limited. Radio contact existed, but coverage was not continuous. Pilots could report position, but those reports were based on the same navigational assumptions made in the cockpit. Ground stations could not track aircraft in real time. They could only receive information as it was transmitted. If an aircraft misjudged its position, that misjudgment could persist unchallenged. Weather forecasting provided general conditions, but not the level of precision available in later decades. Pilots were aware of broad patterns, areas of cloud, expected winds, but localized variations could not always be predicted or avoided. A layer of haze, for example, might not be considered significant from a planning perspective. Yet in flight, it could alter perception, flattening the landscape, reducing contrast, and obscuring the subtle cues that distinguish one location from another. These were not failures of the system. They were the system. Within this framework, routine flights depended on the alignment of multiple variables. Accurate initial heading, correct wind estimation, reliable timekeeping, clear visual references, consistent interpretation. When these aligned, navigation was effective. When they did not, the margin for error narrowed. By the late 1930s, confidence in aviation had grown faster than the infrastructure supporting it. Aircraft were capable of crossing long distances efficiently, but the tools for ensuring positional certainty had not advanced at the same pace. Pilots operated in a transitional space between early exploration and modern precision. They were trained, experienced, and methodical, but they worked within constraints that required continuous judgment. There was no redundancy beyond skill and attention. In this environment, a navigational error was not immediately catastrophic. It began as a deviation, small, manageable, often unnoticed. Only over time did it compound. The route between Sydney and Melbourne passed over terrain that rose gradually in places, forming upland regions that did not present themselves dramatically from the air. Without clear visibility, these elevations could blend into the surrounding landscape. An aircraft maintaining a safe altitude relative to expected terrain might find that assumption invalid if its position was misjudged. But the instruments would not indicate this. They would confirm only what they measured, not what lay ahead. By the time discrepancies became visible, the opportunity to correct them could be limited. The system relied on anticipation, on correctly identifying where the aircraft was before the environment demanded a response. In most cases, this worked. Flights arrived as scheduled. Routes became familiar. Confidence deepened, but the margin remained. unseen, unmeasured, dependent on alignment between expectation and reality. In 1938, that alignment could not be guaranteed, and when it shifted, quietly, without immediate indication, the consequences unfolded not as sudden failure, but as a progression, a sequence of decisions, each reasonable within its context, moving incrementally away from accuracy, until the difference between assumed position and actual location became critical. By then, the system offered no correction, only continuation. Understanding the accident requires separation, not of events, but of influences. Each element involved operated within its limits. None failed in isolation. The outcome emerged from alignment between machine, human judgment, environment, and the systems that connected them. Aircraft. The aircraft assigned to the route was a product of its time, engineered for reliability, range, and passenger service within the constraints of 1930s aviation. It was a twin-engine transport, structurally sound and mechanically dependable when operated within its intended envelope. Its engines were air-cooled radial units, designed for endurance rather than speed. They delivered consistent power, provided they were properly maintained and operated within normal parameters. There is no evidence of mechanical failure. The A-frame responded as expected. Control surfaces functioned normally. The engines maintained output until the final moments. From a technical standpoint, the aircraft remained fully capable of flight, but capability did not extend to awareness. Instrumentation within the cockpit was limited. The pilot had access to a magnetic compass, basic altitude indication, airspeed indicator, engine performance gauges. These instruments describe the aircraft's internal state, its motion through air, its orientation, its mechanical condition. They did not describe its relationship to the ground beyond altitude. There was no terrain mapping, no predictive system, no indication of rising ground ahead. Altitude, in isolation, was only meaningful when paired with accurate position. Without that pairing, it became a number without context. Crew. The responsibility for that context rested entirely with the crew. Pilots operating in this period were not inexperienced. They were trained within the limits of available knowledge and had often accumulated significant flight time across similar routes. Familiarity with terrain and procedure was considered a strength. It allowed for efficiency. It also introduced subtle risk. Routine can stabilize decision-making, but it can also reduce sensitivity to deviation. When a route becomes familiar, the expectation of correctness increases. Observations are more easily interpreted as confirmation rather than contradiction. There is no indication of negligence. The actions taken were consistent with standard navigation practices of the time. Calculations were performed. Landmarks were observed. Adjustments were made as required. But interpretation is not immune to error. A landmark that appears correct can reinforce an incorrect position. Once accepted, that position becomes a foundation for subsequent decisions. Each correction is then based on an initial assumption that may already be flawed. In this way, error does not appear as a single event. It propagates. Environment. The environment did not present itself as hostile. There were no severe storms, no turbulence sufficient to disrupt control. But the conditions were not neutral. Visibility was degraded, not completely, but enough to reduce clarity. Atmospheric haze softened contrast across the landscape. Distant features lacked definition. Depth perception was compromised. Under these conditions, terrain becomes abstract. Features that would normally provide reliable reference, ridges, valleys, clearings, lose their distinct boundaries. They appear flatter, more uniform, less differentiated from surrounding areas. This creates ambiguity, and ambiguity requires interpretation. The terrain itself contributed to this effect. The region consisted of rolling uplands, gradually increasing in elevation without sharp transitions. From the A, especially in reduced visibility, this rise could go unnoticed until proximity made it unavoidable. There were no abrupt indicators, only a continuous change, subtle enough to escape detection when position was misjudged. Systems. The broader system in which the flight operated offered limited support. Navigation procedures relied on a combination of dead reckoning and visual confirmation. There was no independent verification of position beyond what the crew could calculate and observe. Ground-based navigation aids were sparse. Radio communication existed, but it did not provide tracking. Reports were transmitted, but they were based on the same internal assessments made within the cockpit. There was no external correction mechanism. If an aircraft drifted off course, the system did not detect it. It accepted the reported position as accurate. This absence of feedback meant that error, once introduced, could persist without challenge. There were no redundancies designed to identify discrepancy between assumed and actual location. The system trusted the process, and the process depended entirely on alignment between expectation and reality. Convergence. Individually, these elements function within normal limits. The aircraft operated without mechanical fault. The crew followed established procedures. The environment, while imperfect, remained within expected conditions. The system provided the level of support typical for the era, but alignment between them was not maintained. A small navigational deviation, unremarkable at first, interacted with reduced visibility. The environment obscured distinguishing features. The crew interpreted what was visible in a way that confirmed their expectation. The system provided no correction. Each element reinforced the others. The aircraft continued on a course that appeared valid. Altitude remained appropriate, relative to the assumed position, but the assumption was incorrect. And as distance increased, so did the discrepancy. The terrain ahead did not change abruptly. It rose gradually into the aircraft's path. Without accurate positional awareness, there was no reason to anticipate that rise. No trigger for adjustment. No indication that the margin was diminishing. By the time the environment revealed the discrepancy, the opportunity to respond had narrowed beyond recovery. The convergence was complete, not through failure, but through continuity. The final sequence unfolded not with drama, but with inevitability. The aircraft maintained its heading. Engines produced steady power. Controls responded precisely. From inside the cockpit, the routine of flight continued as it had for hours. There was no sudden crisis, no mechanical failure, no abrupt emergency demanding attention. The discrepancy lay in position. A subtle miscalculation, compounded over distance, had placed the aircraft slightly off course. Each passing minute reinforced the assumption that the alignment was correct. Visual references appeared consistent with expectation. The mind confirmed what it sought to confirm. The haze masked the gradual ascent of terrain. A series of ridges and uplands rose imperceptibly. To the pilot, they seemed distant, beneath a safe margin. In reality, the margin had been shrinking. The altitude was sufficient only for the intended route, not the actual shifted path. Subtle cues, the angle of sunlight on tree lines, the pattern of the hills, went unrecognized or were misinterpreted. Each factor was minor, but together they allowed the critical deviation to persist. The descent was minor, controlled, routine. Adjustments were made for perceived approach conditions, not knowing the assumption was wrong. The airspeed remained within normal limits. Instruments indicated no cause for alarm. Everything, by measure, was normal, but normality can deceive. The ground approached slowly, gradually, without sudden warning. Visual confirmation came too late. A feature that appeared as expected, an isolated ridge or clearing, was misidentified. The assumption of position was confirmed one last time. Confidence remained intact. There was no instinctive recognition of impending danger. The convergence of aircraft, terrain, and misjudgment reached its endpoint. The aircraft, still under control, intersected with the rising ground. The sequence was not chaotic. It was procedural, motion consistent with flight, altitude appropriate relative to assumed position, but critically insufficient relative to actual terrain. The crew had no opportunity for recovery. The engines continued to produce thrust. The A-frame responded to controls, but the environment had changed beyond the ability to respond effectively. The rising terrain, previously abstract in Haze, had become reality. The aircraft's path intersected with it precisely where miscalculation and environmental concealment allowed. The intersection was a final act, not violent in its execution, but absolute in its outcome. From the perspective of the broader system, nothing had failed until the point of contact. There were no mechanical errors, no procedural violations outside of navigational misjudgment, no equipment malfunction. The error was a chain of decisions, assumptions, and environmental factors, each reasonable, each reinforcing the next. The engine stopped. The motion ceased. Silence returned. The air above remained unchanged. The land below resumed its quiet continuity. There was no dramatic evidence to an observer from a distance. The sequence had concluded with precision, its impact measured not in spectacle but in consequence. The final moments illustrate a principle still studied today. That controlled flight into terrain is not about loss of control, but about loss of accurate situational awareness. It is a subtle, silent failure, a gap between expectation and reality, between assumed position and actual location. The aftermath began not in dramatic spectacle, but in methodical examination. The aircraft lay amid the landscape, its final position marked by the quiet persistence of terrain. There were no witnesses. There was no immediate clarity. Discovery itself depended on the routine, search patterns, reports of overdue arrival, and the slow accumulation of information from those who had expected the flight to arrive on schedule. The investigation unfolded systematically. Wreckage discovery. Recovery teams navigated the same terrain that had confounded the crew. Rolling hills, low visibility, and sparse access complicated the approach. Each piece of debris was documented, mapped, and photographed. Investigators noted the intact engines, the positions of control surfaces, and the minimal evidence of mechanical failure. From this, one principle became immediately clear. The aircraft had performed as designed. It had not faltered under load. It had not lost control. The event had not been initiated by structural or mechanical failure. Crew and procedures. Examination of the cockpit and operational records confirmed procedural compliance. The crew had followed established navigation practices. Logs, maps, and calculations indicated conscientious attention. Training records showed competence appropriate for the route and era. There was no deviation from expected operational norms. Yet, procedural correctness had not prevented the accident. The pilot's decisions, reasonable within the information available, were insufficient when combined with environmental ambiguity and minor positional miscalculations. Dead reckoning, visual confirmation, and altitude maintenance, each individually reliable, formed a chain that led directly to terrain intersection when assumptions diverged from reality. Environmental factors. Weather records confirmed haze and limited visual contrast. There were no storms, but low-contrast lighting and reduced horizon definition had obscured terrain cues. Investigators emphasized how these conditions contributed to misinterpretation of position. The landscape itself, the rolling hills of southeastern Victoria, was highlighted as a critical factor, its gentle ascent concealed by distance and atmospheric conditions. Systemic observations. The inquiry identified broader systemic weaknesses, navigation limitations, Dead reckoning alone was insufficient for terrain of this variability. Instrumentation gaps. No independent verification existed for position over featureless terrain. Communication constraints. Sparse ground-based radio coverage prevented timely correction or verification. Procedural assumptions. Visual confirmation could be misinterpreted, reinforcing small deviations. The accident illustrated that a single, isolated error was not the cause. Rather, it was the interaction of multiple reasonable factors, a classic example of the error chain. Impact on aviation. The conclusions of the inquiry prompted reflection within Australian civil aviation. Heightened awareness of CFIT, recognition that controlled flight into terrain could occur without mechanical failure led to procedural reassessment. Mapping and instrumentation. Calls for improved charts, altimetry, and eventually radio navigation aids were reinforced. Pilot training enhancements, greater emphasis on cross-checking position, and recognizing ambiguous visual cues. Operational communication. Encouragement of more consistent position reporting and ground verification where feasible. These lessons, quiet and technical, influenced procedures for decades. The accident became a reference point for aviation safety, not for spectacle, but for understanding the limits of human perception and technology in early flight. Consequence through reasoning. The Kyeema crash demonstrates that aviation accidents are rarely singular events. They are the product of environmental ambiguity, instrumentation and system limitations, human interpretation, the cumulative effect of small errors. In 1938, the system was still maturing. The accident exposed a latent risk within routine operations and the reliance on assumptions that could not always be verified. Its significance lies in the lessons extracted, not the tragedy itself. The chain of causality was respected in reconstruction. There was no dramatization of impact, no attempt to sensationalize. The aircraft, the crew, and the environment were understood within the context of their capabilities and limitations. The story was a process, alignment, and the quiet fragility of early aviation systems. The Kyeema crash did not end with a single moment of catastrophe. Its legacy unfolded quietly, through analysis, reflection, and a gradual evolution of aviation practice. Lessons in navigation and awareness. The investigation underscored a fundamental principle. Situational awareness is not guaranteed by instruments or procedure alone. Even in a mechanically sound aircraft, flight depends on accurate understanding of position relative to the terrain. The accident highlighted the limitations of dead reckoning when paired with imperfect visual references. Subsequent procedures emphasized redundancy. Pilots were encouraged to cross-check positional information, particularly over featureless or ambiguous terrain. Visual confirmation, once efficient, was now supported by radio navigation aids and improved charting. Advances in instrumentation and training. The accident reinforced the need for technological support. Radio beacons and navigation aids became a focus of development, providing pilots with reference points independent of sight. Altimetry accuracy and standardized procedures for minimum safe altitudes over upland terrain were strengthened. Pilot training programs incorporated scenarios emphasizing misinterpretation of landmarks, ensuring crews recognize the potential for error in otherwise routine flights. These improvements did not erase risk, but they reduced it, turning lessons from tragedy into proactive safety measures. Cultural impact on aviation. Within the Australian aviation community, the Kyeema crash became a reference point, not for sensational retelling, but for methodical reflection. The accident reminded operators, regulators, and crews of the fragility of alignment between human judgment, environment, and machine. It reinforced that routine flight, however familiar, could conceal hidden hazards. The discussion of CFIT gained prominence. Controlled flight into terrain was recognized as a predictable outcome when certain conditions aligned, rather than an unpredictable or inexplicable event. That understanding informed procedures worldwide, influencing both civilian and military operations. Quiet legacy. In the decades that followed, advances in navigation, communication, and training slowly rendered conditions like those of 1938 increasingly rare. Yet the memory of the accident persisted in manuals, safety bulletins, and procedural checklists. It served as a benchmark, a reminder that early aviation relied as much on judgment as technology, and that the margin for error, though invisible, was real. The landscape itself absorbed the event with neutrality. Hills remained. Ridges continued to rise. Haze still blurred distant forms. But the system, the procedures, instruments, and understanding derived from that moment was forever changed. Safety, in this sense, is cumulative. Each lesson, each adjustment, each procedure is an echo of previous limitations, refined and applied. The Kyeema crash exemplifies this process. The transformation of tragedy into enduring knowledge, the quiet refinement of flight practice, and the persistent pursuit of alignment between expectation and reality. The narrative ends not with spectacle, but with thought. Flight continues. The engines run. Aircraft move across the same landscape. Pilots, now guided by improved tools and procedures, maintain vigilance. And the lessons of 1938 remain present, not as fear, but as wisdom.